Blood dripped from the cold steel of the king's blade. He was an alpha who had conquered nations, yet, as he raised his sword to execute the trembling Omega, before him, a torn collar revealed a map of brutal, agonizing scars. The king's heart stopped. He knew those marks. The year was 2026, and the sovereign territory of the Northern Isles was a kingdom built on blood modernization and the uncompromising biology of secondary genders. King Alistair Montgomery was a man forged in the fires of betrayal. At 32, the Alpha King had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 civil wars, and the crushing weight of a crown that felt heavier with each passing year. He was a ruler who had traded his soul for the stability of his people, a man whose scent, a sharp, suffocating blend of winter storms and crushed pine, demanded absolute submission from anyone who entered his presence. Alistair's current target was the sprawling, opulent estate of the Whittaker family, nestled deep within the foggy moors of West Yorkshire. Lord Reginald Whittaker, a corrupt and greedy alpha, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Intelligence reports verified by the Royal Treasury in Zurich and encrypted communications intercepted from the Geneva Syndicate confirmed that Reginald had been funding underground rebel factions. Worse, the Whittaker patriarch had plotted regicide, attempting to orchestrate an explosion at St. Jude's Cathedral during the royal coronation anniversary. Treason in Alistair's kingdom carried only one penalty: the total eradication of the traitor's bloodline. Rain lashed against the stone gargoyles of the Whittaker Manor as Alistair's elite tactical unit, the Vanguard, breached the heavy oak doors. Gunfire echoed through the halls, a sharp contrast to the archaic ceremonial broadsword strapped to the king's back. While his men carried modern weaponry, Alistair adhered to the ancient laws of his ancestors. A royal execution was not delegated to bullets. It was a burden the king had to bear with his own hands. It was the only way to ensure the gravity of taking a life was never lost on him. Yet deep down, Alistair was suffocating. The endless cycle of violence had hollowed him out. He felt entirely empty, a ghost of an alpha mechanically going through the motions of power. Inside the manor's grand foyer, the air was thick with the foul, sour stench of alpha terror. Reginald Whittaker and his 2 eldest sons were forced to their knees on the imported marble floor, their hands bound behind their backs with heavy, tactical zip ties. They blubbered, begged, and spewed excuses, their dominance entirely shattered under the crushing weight of Alistair's pheromones. Alistair walked past them, his heavy combat boots echoing in the cavernous space. He didn't bother looking at them. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room, where 2 Vanguard guards were dragging out the final member of the Whittaker family. It was an Omega. Rowan Whittaker was a ghost of a man. Unlike the rest of his wealthy, pampered family, Rowan did not wear tailored silk or imported cashmere. He was draped in an oversized, threadbare linen shirt that looked more like a servant's tunic. His frame was dangerously fragile wrists, bound tightly together, his pale skin practically translucent in the dim lighting of the foyer. His head hung low, a curtain of damp, dark hair, hiding his features. Alistair felt a flicker of disgust, though not toward the Omega. He was disgusted by the situation. He hated executing Omegas. By nature, they were rarely involved in the political machinations of their alpha relatives. But the law was the law, and leaving a surviving heir of a traitorous house would only invite vengeance a decade down the line. Is this all of them? Alistair's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. Yes, Your Majesty. His lieutenant, a scarred beta named Harrison, confirmed. The patriarch, his 2 alpha sons, and the youngest, an Omega. Records show he's barely left the estate in 10 years. Alistair drew his broadsword. The scrape of the steel against the leather scabbard was a death knell. The weapon was a massive, ancient piece of forged steel passed down through the Montgomery line. The king approached Reginald first. He offered no final words, no grand speech. The patriarch's execution was swift, brutal, and efficient. His sons followed moments later. Alistair's face remained an unreadable mask of stone, though internally a heavy darkness pressed against his chest. He was drowning in his own ruthlessness, wondering if there was any humanity left inside him to salvage. Finally, Alistair turned to Rowan. The Omega was still kneeling on the marble, his knees pressed into the pooling blood of his family. Yet to Alistair's profound surprise, the Omega was not crying. The overwhelming stench of distress and terror that usually flooded from an Omega in danger was completely absent. Instead, Rowan's scent was incredibly faint, a subtle muted whisper of rain-washed lilies, deeply suppressed and strangely resigned. "Bring him to the courtyard," Alistair commanded, his voice tight. He couldn't do it inside. The air was too thick, the marble too slick with the blood of the guilty. He needed the cold, unforgiving rain of West Yorkshire to wash away the sins of the night. The guards hauled Rowan to his feet. The Omega stumbled, his legs trembling violently, but he didn't fight. He allowed himself to be dragged out into the torrential downpour. The storm outside was ferocious, matching the violent tempest raging inside the Alpha King's soul. Alistair followed, his blood-stained sword gripped tightly in his gauntleted hand, preparing to extinguish the last remaining spark of the Whittaker line, entirely unaware that the blade he held was about to shatter his reality. The central courtyard of the Whittaker estate was a desolate expanse of cracked cobblestones and overgrown hedges, illuminated only by the harsh, sweeping spotlights of the vanguard's armored vehicles. The rain was freezing, beating down mercilessly on the soldiers and their king. Rowan was forced down onto his knees in the center of the courtyard. The cold mud soaked instantly through his thin trousers. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. He knew what was coming. He had spent his entire life in the shadows of this estate, a prisoner to his father's cruel whims and his brother's sadistic tendencies. To them, an Omega son was a curse, a defective piece of property to be hidden away and punished for his mere existence. For Rowan, the terrifying, towering figure of King Alistair Montgomery was not a harbinger of tragedy, but an angel of mercy. Death was simply the final, long-awaited key to his cage. Alistair stepped up behind him. The vanguard soldiers formed a wide perimeter, giving their king the space required for the solemn act. The only sound was the howling wind and the heavy patter of the rain. Rowan Whittaker. Alistair spoke over the storm, his voice carrying the full, terrifying authority of the crown. Your bloodline has been found guilty of high treason against the sovereign throne. By the ancient laws of this kingdom, the penalty is death. Rowan did not flinch. He did not beg. He slowly tilted his head back, closing his eyes, letting the freezing rain wash over his pale, bruised face. He offered his neck an instinctual act of submission, but one completely devoid of fear. Alistair hesitated. The king's grip on the hilt of his sword tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had executed cowards, monsters, and zealots, but he had never executed someone who welcomed the blade. It unsettled him. It made the beast inside his chest thrash with unease. Why wasn't the Omega fighting? Why wasn't he screaming for mercy? "Have you no final words?" Alistair demanded, a strange frustration bleeding into his tone. Rowan's voice, when he finally spoke, was raspy and broken from years of disuse, barely louder than a whisper. "Make it quick, Your Majesty. I am tired." The utter exhaustion in the Omega's words resonated so deeply within Alistair that it felt like a physical blow. It was the mirror echo of his own soul. Gritting his teeth, Alistair forced the empathy down. He could not afford weakness. He was the king. Alistair raised the heavy broadsword high above his head. The steel gleamed ominously under the harsh glare of the tactical floodlights. He adjusted his stance, preparing to bring the blade down in one clean, painless arc. But as the wind howled, a sudden violent gust tore across the courtyard. It ripped at Rowan's soaked, threadbare tunic. The flimsy linen, already worn to the breaking point, gave way under the strain of his bound arms and the wind. The fabric split down the back with a sharp tearing sound, exposing the Omega's pale shoulders and spine to the freezing rain. Alistair began his downward swing, and then he saw them. The sword stopped mere inches from Rowan's neck, the sheer force of Alistair halting the momentum, causing a loud, sickening crack in the king's own shoulder joint. Alistair ignored the pain. His eyes were wide-blown entirely black as his pupils dilated in shock, fixated on the Omega's exposed skin. Rowan's back was not pale and pristine. It was a horrifying tapestry of violence. Thick raised keloid scars crisscrossed over his spine, the unmistakable remnants of a heavy metal-tipped whip. There were circular burn marks scattered across his shoulder blades, old and silvery. But it was the mark in the dead center of Rowan's right shoulder blade that made the air leave Alistair's lungs. It was a burn scar, jagged and crude, shaped like a fractured lion's head, the crest of the House of Montgomery. Alistair's mind violently snapped back to 5 years ago. The Manchester uprising. The king separated from his guard, ambushed by rebels in a burning alleyway. A rebel had raised a heated branding iron, aiming to scar the young king's face as a trophy before killing him. But someone had leapt from the shadows. A slender masked figure who threw himself in front of Alistair, taking the searing iron to his own back, then dragging the wounded king to safety before disappearing into the chaos of the riots. Alistair had spent years searching for his savior, utilizing every resource in Zurich and London, but the trail had gone cold. The sword slipped from Alistair's numb fingers. It hit the cobblestones with a deafening metallic clang that echoed across the silent courtyard. The vanguard soldiers tensed, reaching for their weapons, confused by the sudden drop of the executioner's blade. But Alistair didn't see them. The cold, ruthless Alpha King crashed to his knees in the mud right behind the trembling Omega. Rowan flinched at the loud noise, his eyes flying open in confusion. He expected the sharp bite of steel, but instead he felt a massive, trembling hand hover over his scarred back, not quite touching him, as if afraid he was an illusion that would shatter. "You!" Alistair choked out his voice, entirely stripped of its royal cadence. It was the desperate, raw sound of a broken man. "It was you." The realization hit Alistair like a freight train. Reginald Whittaker hadn't just hidden his Omega son out of shame. He had tortured him. Rowan had saved the king during the uprising, an act of supreme treason against his own rebel-sympathizing family. When Reginald found out, he had dragged his son back to this estate and made him pay for his loyalty in blood and agony, using the very crest of the king he had saved to brand him like livestock. The scent of the king's pheromones shifted violently. The suffocating aggressive winter storm transformed instantly into an overwhelming, desperate wave of alpha protection. It was thick, heavy, and undeniably possessive. Alistair unclasped his heavy, fur-lined royal cloak. With shaking hands, he wrapped the massive, warm garment tightly around Rowan's freezing, scarred shoulders. He pulled the fragile Omega back against his chest, shielding him from the rain, from the guards, from the world. "Stand down!" Alistair roared at his men, a guttural, earth-shaking command that forced several alphas in his guard to drop their gaze submissively. Rowan was frozen in shock, leaning against the solid, burning heat of the Alpha King's chest. He didn't understand. He was supposed to die. Yet the arms wrapped around him were not holding him captive. They were holding him together. "I have you," Alistair whispered fiercely into Rowan's wet hair, a vow sealed in the pouring rain. "I swear on my life you will never feel pain again." The heavy doors of the royal armoured SUV slammed shut, sealing King Alistair and the broken Omega inside a cocoon of bulletproof glass and reinforced steel. The torrential rain of West Yorkshire was instantly muffled, replaced by the low, powerful hum of the vehicle's engine. Outside, the vanguard soldiers moved with absolute disciplined urgency, their tactical boots splashing through the mud as they secured the perimeter and prepared the convoy for immediate departure. They did not question their king's sudden reversal of the execution order. The Montgomery monarchy was built on absolute loyalty, and Alistair's word was law. Inside the cavernous, leather-scented interior of the SUV Alistair held Rowan with a terrifying gentleness. The Omega had lost consciousness the moment Alistair had wrapped him in the fur-lined cloak, his frail body finally giving out after years of sustained terror and malnourishment. Rowan felt impossibly light in the Alpha's massive arms, his breathing frighteningly shallow. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic primal rhythm that he hadn't felt since the dark days of the Manchester uprising. "Get us to London," Alistair barked into the vehicle's intercom, his voice vibrating with a dangerous edge. "St. Thomas Hospital. Tell Dr. Arthur Pendleton to clear the entire secure wing and prepare for critical trauma. If we hit traffic, clear the M1 motorway with military force. Go!" As the convoy sped off into the night, Alistair carefully peeled back the soaked, ruined linen of Rowan's tunic to properly examine the damage. The faint glow of the streetlights outside washed over the horrific tapestry of scars. The burn mark in the center of Rowan's back, the fractured lion's head of the Montgomery crest, was severely raised and brutally scarred, an undeniable testament to a branding iron applied with vicious intent. Alistair traced the edge of the scar with a trembling, leather-clad finger. The sheer magnitude of his own blindness crashed over him. While he had been sitting on his velvet throne in Buckingham Palace, the very saviour who had bled to keep him there was locked away in a freezing manner, tortured by his own flesh and blood. The alpha beast within Alistair roared, demanding vengeance. But the rational king knew that Reginald Whittaker and his alpha sons were already dead on the courtyard cobblestones. The blood debt was paid, but the guilt remained a heavy, suffocating anchor around Alistair's neck. 2 hours later, the convoy screeched to a halt outside the heavily guarded underground entrance of St. Thomas Hospital in central London. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the chief royal physician, was waiting with a team of specialized trauma nurses. They rushed a gurney toward the SUV, but Alistair refused to let the Omega go. The king, still covered in the mud and blood of the execution, carried Rowan through the sterile white halls himself, his suffocating protective winter storm pheromones, forcing the hospital staff to lower their eyes in instinctual submission. In the secure royal medical suite, Alistair was finally forced to step back as Dr. Pendleton's team went to work. Hours bled into one another. Alistair paced the observation room like a caged predator, his eyes fixed on the heart monitor through the one-way glass. When Dr. Pendleton finally emerged, his face was gravely pale. He was an older beta, seasoned by decades of patching up royal soldiers, but the chart in his hands trembled slightly. "Speak," Alistair commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet it filled the room with undeniable authority. "Your Majesty." Dr. Pendleton began choosing his words carefully. "The physical trauma is extensive. Beyond the whipping scars and the branding, he has multiple poorly healed fractures in his ribs and clavicle. Severe vitamin D and calcium deficiencies indicate he hasn't seen natural sunlight in years. The doctor paused, swallowing hard. But that is not the most alarming discovery. Alistair stopped pacing, his gaze locking onto the doctor with lethal intensity. Explain. We ran a full toxicology and endocrine panel, Doctor. Pendleton continued adjusting his glasses. Rowan's omega biology has been systematically suppressed. We found dangerously high trace levels of an illegal synthetic inhibitor, specifically a black market compound manufactured by a rogue pharmaceutical front in Berlin, known in the Geneva Syndicate as Nullify Z. It is designed to chemically castrate an omega, suppressing their heats, their scent, and their ability to bond. His father wasn't just hiding him, Your Majesty. He was erasing his very nature to ensure he could never form a mate bond, never seek protection from an alpha, and never produce an heir. The silence in the room was deafening. The sheer cruelty of the revelation shattered the last remaining barriers of Alistair's composure. The heavy glass of the medical observation window cracked under the sudden, violent spike of Alistair's aggressive pheromones. "Can it be reversed?" Alistair asked, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "With time, extensive medical care, and a safe environment, yes." Dr. Pendleton nodded quickly. But the psychological trauma of having his biology artificially suppressed for a decade, that will require immense patience. He will be terrified of his own instincts once they return. Alistair looked through the cracked glass at the fragile Omega sleeping in the hospital bed. Rowan looked so incredibly small amidst the sterile white sheets and IV tubes. The king made a silent, unbreakable vow to the sleeping boy. He would tear down the very foundations of his kingdom to keep Rowan safe. When Rowan finally opened his eyes 3 days later, the first thing he registered was the smell. It was not the damp, mouldy stench of his cell in the Whitaker estate, nor the metallic tang of his own blood. It was the deep, comforting aroma of winter storms and crushed pine. He panicked, his heart rate spiking on the monitor. He scrambled backward, ripping an IV from his arm, expecting the heavy strike of his father's cane. "Rowan, peace," a deep, rumbling voice spoke. Alistair was instantly by his side, his movements incredibly slow and telegraphed so as not to startle the Omega further. The King of the Northern Isles dropped to his knees beside the hospital bed, completely disregarding his royal status. He kept his hands visible and pressed them against the mattress. "You are safe," Alistair said softly, his dark eyes brimming with a vulnerability the world had never seen. "You are in London. Your father is dead. Your brothers are dead. Nobody will ever lay a hand on you again." Rowan stared at the king, his breath hitching. His voice was a broken rasp. "Why?" Alistair reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy, forged silver medallion, the royal crest of the Montgomery family. He laid it gently on the edge of the bed. "Because 5 years ago in Manchester, you gave up your life to save mine. And I have spent every day since failing to find you. I am so profoundly sorry, Rowan." Tears, hot and unbidden, finally spilled over Rowan's bruised cheeks. For the first time in his entire life, the Omega allowed himself to weep, and the ruthless Alpha King stayed on his knees, standing guard over his savior's shattered soul. Weeks turned into a fragile, tentative month. Rowan was transferred from the sterile confines of St. Thomas Hospital to the heavily fortified private wing of Buckingham Palace. The king's personal chambers were transformed into a sanctuary of warmth and security, filled with plush rugs, crackling fireplaces, and an army of vetted beta staff whose only directive was to ensure the Omega's absolute comfort. As the illegal suppressants slowly washed out of his system, Rowan's true nature began to bloom. His pale, sunken cheeks filled with colour, and his dull hair regained a rich, dark lustre. More importantly, his scent, the beautiful calming aroma of rain-washed lilies, began to return, gently permeating the royal corridors. Alistair spent every available moment by Rowan's side. The ruthless king, known for his cold efficiency in Parliament and the battlefield, became incredibly soft in the presence of the Omega. They spent hours in the royal library, where Alistair discovered a shocking truth. Rowan was not merely a victim. He possessed an unparalleled, brilliant mind. During his years of imprisonment, Rowan had secretly hacked into his father's private servers, using a smuggled, outdated tablet. He had been monitoring the Whittaker family's treasonous communications with the Geneva Syndicate for years, deliberately sabotaging their efforts from the shadows. That was how I knew where you would be in Manchester. Rowan confessed one evening, sitting by the fireplace, with a thick wool blanket draped over his shoulders. His eyes met Alistair's, no longer clouded with fear, but sharp with intelligence. I saw my father's encrypted deployment orders for the rebel ambush. I couldn't stop the attack, but I could slip out and try to find you first. Alistair stared at him in awe. You dismantled a treasonous plot from a locked basement, armed with nothing but a stolen tablet. Rowan offered a small, shy smile. I had a lot of free time. However, the tranquility of their sanctuary was soon shattered by the brutal reality of politics. The High Council, a coalition of powerful Alpha Lords who governed the kingdom's legislative branch, grew restless. Led by Lord Brighton, a cunning and traditionalist Alpha who secretly despised Alistair's modernization efforts, the council demanded an audience. In the grand throne room, beneath the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers, the political storm finally broke. Lord Brighton stood before the king, brandishing a heavy parchment scroll. Your Majesty, Brighton's voice echoed with barely concealed contempt. The law of treason is absolute. The eradication of the Whittaker bloodline must be absolute. By harboring the Omega son of Lord Reginald, you are violating the very foundation of our legal code. The boy must be executed, or the council will be forced to declare a constitutional crisis. We cannot have a traitor's spawn residing in Buckingham Palace. Alistair sat on the throne, his posture rigid, his pheromones spiking with a lethal icy fury. He gripped the armrests so tightly the ancient wood groaned. The boy saved my life in Manchester. He is a hero of the crown. He is a Whittaker, Brighton spat back. His blood is tainted. If you do not hand him over to the executioner, you risk a civil war. The Southern Lords will not stand for this blatant disregard of the law. The tension in the room was explosive. The royal guards shifted uneasily, hands hovering near their sidearms. Alistair stood up, ready to draw his broadsword and slaughter the entire council if they dared take one step toward his chambers. He would gladly burn the kingdom to ash before letting them touch Rowan. But before Alistair could issue the order to arrest Lord Brighton, the heavy oak doors of the throne room swung open. The entire court gasped. Standing in the doorway was Rowan. He was no longer the fragile, broken ghost from the courtyard. He was dressed in a finely tailored midnight blue suit that hugged his healing frame. He stood tall, projecting an air of undeniable dignity. Flanked by Dr. Pendleton and a vanguard escort, Rowan walked directly into the center of the hostile Alpha-dominated room. You speak of treason, Lord Brighton. Rowan said, his voice steady and clear, echoing perfectly in the grand hall. He held up a small encrypted black hard drive. During my imprisonment, I documented every financial transaction my father made to the rebel factions. I also documented his co-conspirators. Lord Brighton's face drained of color. He took a hesitant step back. This drive. Rowan continued his gaze, piercing through the corrupt politician, contains verified bank transfers from a secure Credit Suisse account directly linking you, Lord Brighton, to the cathedral bombing plot. You weren't trying to uphold the law today. You were trying to execute the only living witness to your own treason. Chaos erupted in the throne room. Alistair didn't hesitate. Vanguard arrest Lord Brighton and his associates for high treason against the crown. As the guards swarmed the screaming, struggling council members, Alistair descended the steps of the throne. He walked straight toward Rowan, ignoring the political upheaval happening just feet away. The king stopped in front of the Omega, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with an intense, overwhelming adoration. "You should not have left the safe wing," Alistair whispered, though there was no anger in his voice, only absolute wonder. "I couldn't let them threaten you," Rowan replied softly, looking up into the Alpha's eyes. "You protected me in the courtyard. Let me protect you in the court." Alistair reached out gently, cupping Rowan's cheek. The air around them grew thick, the heavy scent of winter pine seamlessly intertwining with the sweet aroma of rain-washed lilies. In front of the remaining lords, the royal guards and the scattered remnants of the court, Alistair made his ultimate declaration. "Rowan Whittaker." Alistair announced, his voice booming with royal authority, yet laced with profound emotional reverence. "You are no longer a captive, nor are you a traitor's son. Before this court and before the gods, I claim you." Rowan's breath hitched tears springing to his eyes as he tilted his head, baring his neck to the king in an act of ultimate trust and submission. Alistair leaned down, his lips brushing against the pulse point on Rowan's neck, before he sank his teeth into the soft flesh, sealing the mate bond. A jolt of pure electrifying warmth surged between them, rewriting their destinies in a single heartbeat. The scars on Rowan's back would always remain, a map of his painful past. But as the Alpha King held his newly claimed mate against his chest, the Omega finally knew that his future would be nothing but love, absolute safety, and a kingdom forged in the unbreakable bond of their survival. Did this intense Omegaverse tale of brutal betrayal, hidden scars, and destined mates leave you breathless? The Alpha King proved that true strength isn't in the swing of a sword, but in protecting the one you love against the entire world. If you felt your heart race during Rowan's brave stand and Alistair's fierce devotion, smash that like button, share this story with your fellow BL drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling original audio dramas.